Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm not sure I agree with all of it. It was a little bit exaggerated here and there, but whatever, I take it. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon. Is this microphone working the way it's supposed to? Okay. My talk today is going to be based on my book, Tropic of Chaos, Climate Change and the New Geography of Violence, which argues that climate change, one of the main ways that climate change is going to affect society is by increasing violence. And I think I'm going to turn this map off for a second. I'm really not a big, if I just do this, does this go out? Oh no, well, this one, getting that out of my face is good. All right, so the thesis of the book is that climate change is already a driver of violence, that this is not just something that is going to happen down the line if climate change continues unmitigated and gets worse, but that you can already see ways in which climate change is exacerbating situations to make them more violent or to turn social conflicts into violent conflicts. And the best way to show this is how the book begins. The book begins in the Turkana region of Kenya, in northwest Kenya, and there had just been a cattle raid in which a number of people were killed a day before, and there was a man of about 35 years old lying dead at my feet. His name was Ekaru Lorman, and he had been killed in this cattle raid. And so I decided to structure this investigation around asking him, why did this guy die? What caused this man's death? And at one level what happened was that his neighbors, the Pokot, who live up in the Karasuk Hills, a range in Kenya, had come down to steal his cattle, and he had tried to defend his cattle, and in this process 6 people had been killed. But you have to ask, well, why are people fighting so viciously over cattle? At one level, in the pastoralist corridor of East Africa, cattle raiding is an old and venerable tradition. This has gone on as long as anyone can remember. But in recent years, it has become increasingly violent, partly because there's a surplus of very powerful weaponry, AK-47s and lots of cheap ammunition. And so people who own very few things other than their animals, they have very little wealth. Their wealth is all tied up in their animals. They have very few radios. They have no vehicles. But they have, all the men have these sturdy, fairly sophisticated machine guns. So part of the answer lies in, well, why was this cattle raid conducted on both sides with these weapons? And the other part of it is why this increase in this fight for cattle? And part of that answer lies in the fact that there's a really severe drought in East Africa. And it is causing pastoralists to fight over what few sources of water remain, boreholes or access to rivers. In the drought, the cattle get sick, they die, so to replenish your herd, you have to go take your neighbor's cattle. But why is that the solution? Why aren't there government programs to help these people? Why aren't there veterinary services being extended to these pastoralists to help their animals through these hard times? Why isn't there a program of alternative development to get, help pastoralists move towards more sustainable livelihoods if in fact there is going to be this persistent drought? So in all these factors, I think lies the answer. So at one level, what all of this says is that climate change never acts upon human conflicts in isolation from other causes. It's always intertwined with or imbricated with other pre-existing problems. And what I found in this investigation that took me across the planet pretty much was that what's going on now is that climate change is kicking in the form of extreme weather, which frequently means increased drought punctuated by increased flooding. So as soon as I left the Turkana region, there was a massive, totally out-of-season flood. And when I checked with the meteorological department in Kenya about what precipitation rates were like over the last 30 years, turns out they've been going up. So Kenya's actually getting more water, and even these dry regions are getting more water. It's just that it comes all at once in the wrong time, in the wrong place, and so the overall effect is desertification. Washing away topsoil, the water coming quickly can't seep into the ground to replenish the water table, so it's lost down the rivers. So, you know, this drought is, it's hard to blame any one event on climate change, but this drought fits the pattern that climate scientists have predicted for this region for about 30 years of increased drought plus increased precipitation. So I see this, if not directly caused by climate change, fitting the pattern that has been predicted. So why the guns? Why no support from the state? Well, basically because climate change always works through these pre-existing crises. And the main ones are the results of neoliberal economic restructuring, which is to say radical free market economic restructuring pushed by the powerful economies through the main financial institutions of the world economy, like the World Bank and the IMF, upon the global south, and demanding that in exchange for lifeline loans, developing economies in the global south should follow the economic advice produced by the University of Chicago, the University of UC Berkeley, London School of Economics, where I got my PhD, is another hotbed of this sort of hard right free market economics. And what this theory holds is that markets have a sort of inner logic of their own, almost like an ecology, and that if you get the state out of the way, the market knows best, it will find equilibrium, it will correct, and you will get full employment and growth and prosperity. In fact, that doesn't play out if you look at history and you look at the record of neoliberalism. And so neoliberalism as a set of policies means that governments should privatize whatever businesses they own, and you know, throughout much of the world, including the global south, for much of the last century, governments were heavily involved. Even capitalist governments, or the governments of capitalist economies, were heavily involved in the economy. They owned utilities, they owned telecommunications companies, they owned airlines, they frequently owned seed distribution companies, they owned the irrigation companies. So there was a theory of economic development within capitalism, you know, broadly defined as Keynesianism, sort of developmentalism, that held that for capitalism, a market economy based on the private ownership of the means of production, to really work well, you actually need a little bit of socialism. You actually need the state to participate in the economy. This was the guiding economic theory from the 1930s into the early 1980s. And that's when there's a tremendous shift in the thinking of policy elites in the core economies, and they begin to push this down upon the global south. So that means in a place like Kenya, that underwent structural adjustment beginning in the early 90s, that the state has sold off its assets and in the name of a more efficient economy basically been reduced to the point where it doesn't really have the capacity to help people like Ekaru Lorman. The only thing the Kenyan state is really capable of is famine response. They've got a sort of like internationally coordinated, they've got their local piece of an internationally coordinated famine response effort. But actual development, responding to persistent extreme weather like this, planning for the future, doesn't have the capacity because it has been systematically stripped of those capacities in the name of efficiency. And I found this as one of the exacerbating pre-existing crises that that climate change acts upon throughout the developing world, the global south. The other pre-existing crisis, the guns, these AK-47s floating around everywhere, where do they come from? They're the legacy of Cold War militarism. And they're the infrastructure, they're pieces of the infrastructure left over from the conflict between the Soviet Union and the US through proxies in the global south. So specifically what that meant in the case of Kenya is that the AK-47s and light weapons like that first entered Kenya with the collapse of Idi Amin's military in the late 70s, and he was the dictator of Uganda. He was built up by the West in the hopes that he would be some sort of bulwark against socialism in the Horn of Africa. He was on his own trip. He was a megalomaniac, I mean, pretty clearly actually insane, built up one of the largest armies in Africa at that time, and basically allowed his state to collapse by attacking Tanzania and starting a war that he couldn't finish. So the end result of that was that his army disintegrated, and the armories in Uganda were looted. And so tens of thousands of weapons flow into Kenya. Next big pulse of cheap weapons into Kenya is Somalia, which to this day is a failed state, and to this day hemorrhages weapons into that region. Why did Somalia collapse in 1991? What's that story? Well, sadly, the story is that with the best of intentions on both sides, the socialist camp and the capitalist camp in the Cold War poured weaponry into a conflict between Ethiopia and Somalia. And it has very strange origins. What happens is in 1969, there's a coup d'etat in Somalia. A left-wing dictator, Said Barre, comes to power. He declares himself a scientific socialist. He says socialism is compatible with Islam and a pastoralist way of life. But really, more than anything, he's a Somali nationalist, and he wants to reunite the pieces of Somali territory that had been carved up by colonialism. And the one piece that was never reunited into Somalia was the Ogden region, this kind of point here in Ethiopia, where there are a lot of Somali-speaking people. So he begins sending weapons and support to build up a guerrilla movement in Ethiopia. Around the same time, there's also a communist coup d'etat against Haile Selassie, the emperor of Ethiopia, and you get a group of young communist officers take power in Ethiopia. And so for a brief moment, you actually have Cuban and Soviet support behind Said Barre and behind the junta, the dirge as it's called, in Ethiopia. Said Barre finds out that his supporters are also supporting the Ethiopians, and to the credit of the Cubans, who are in many ways leading this and sort of dragging the Soviet Union into this, they were trying to bring peace between these two countries. They thought this was an insane, incipient little conflict that would get out of hand. And sure enough, it does get out of hand. Said Barre, realizing that there are that Cuban troops and Russian advisors and support are on the opposite side of this conflict, switches sides in the Cold War overnight, kicks the Soviets and Cubans out, curries favor with the Carter administration, and is soon receiving enormous amounts of weapons and money from the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. Now, this conflict ends similarly to how Idi Amin's regime collapsed. Uganda has since been put back together into a somewhat, stable state, even though there's still warfare in parts of Uganda. But Somalia is, still fundamentally a failed state. So it was not the intention of Fidel Castro nor Jimmy Carter that Somalia should collapse into, 25 years of bloody lawlessness. But that was the end result. On the socialist side, Fidel thought he was, opposing a system that was about exploiting the poor and accumulating wealth in the hands of a few, and that bred war, and that the long-term survival of the human race depended on socialism. For Carter, on his side, he felt that socialism was undemocratic, that you look at Cuba, you look at the Soviet Union, there are no elections, there isn't sufficient freedom, that in fact capitalism, though it has rough edges, actually unleashes human creativity and is a superior system. So both sides are motivated by their highest ideals. The facts on the ground are that weapons are pumped into this conflict, which is really about local ethnic and national issues, local nationalisms, but gets caught up into this sort of architecture, this political architecture of the Cold War, and becomes a proxy fight between the two great camps, the two great ideological camps. The end result is the collapse of Said Barre's army along clan lines in the first days of 1991. And since then, Somalia has been a failed state. And after 91, a second great pulse of cheap weapons went into Kenya. So exacerbating, helping to fuel the conflict that was, an endemic part of the political economy around cattle raiding. So in this example, you see how climate change, neoliberalism, and the legacy of Cold War militarism come together to fuel violence in a way, in a fashion that's very direct at the point of contact. People fighting over water, people fighting over animals and water in an extremely and unusually dry geography. So that is what it appears to be, right? A small local resource war fueled by global dynamics. And I call this combination of the onset of anthropogenic climate change in the form of extreme weather, mixing with the legacy of neoliberal economic restructuring and Cold War militarism, I call this the catastrophic convergence. And the point is that climate change always acts through these pre-existing crises, and not always in the same way everywhere. Some places it's sort of equally distributed, as in the example of Kenya, where you can sort of see the legacy of, or the causality of each of these components. But go to another place like Afghanistan, where in many ways the idea of the book first came to me while reporting in Afghanistan. And I did a series of stories on the heroin trade, on opium poppy, from which comes the poppy flower, from which comes opium, and from that comes heroin. And Afghanistan produces over 90% of the world's heroin. It's a huge part of the economy. In the war that's still going on there, there's one side that attacks the growing of poppy, and that is the Karzai government and the NATO forces, and another side which defends the farmers' right to grow poppy, and that is the Taliban. So I was researching, why do people grow this crop that can get them in trouble with the state? What are the alternatives? Are there any alternative livelihoods? What's a realistic response to this? And one thing that the farmers always said, well, I guess that's going, oh, there we go. When I asked them, why do you grow poppy? Why do you take these risks? Part of the answer was always, it's very drought resistant. And at first I didn't even really hear that and didn't think about it that much. And a couple years later I did another story, and again, different place in Afghanistan, same thing. And it turns out poppy uses 1/5 to 1/6 the amount of water that wheat or other traditional crops in Afghanistan use. And Afghanistan happens to be undergoing the worst drought in living memory, which has coincided with the whole NATO occupation there. And again, is this drought solely attributable to climate change? Hard to say. But what you can say is it fits a pattern that has been predicted by the most sophisticated climate models in the world. So what that means is that if there is a severe drought, a decade-long drought, and it is partially caused by climate change, exacerbated by climate change, and there's one side that attacks poppy, well, and so there's this drought, and that fact alone means that poppy becomes the only crop under those environmental conditions that is economically feasible. If there isn't enough water to grow apricots or grapes, you can't do it. It doesn't matter how much you want to. And so the farmers turn to poppy because you can, in fact, under these drought conditions, make some money and feed your children. And in the war, one side will attack your efforts to feed your child in the name of fighting a global drug scourge, not in the name of preventing you from feeding your children, while the other side will say, hey, look, we will help you, we will support you and defend you, and in exchange, you defend us. You hide guns for us, this being the Taliban. You hide guns when we need you to hide guns. You act as our lookouts. Maybe some of your sons come join us and help us drive these infidels who are also attacking your existence, get them out of our country. And so you can see how, along with all of the other big causes driving the war in Afghanistan, there is a little element of climate change driving it. Part of the reason that the Taliban have an endless line of recruits is because they are the side defending the farmers' right to exist. Not to reduce the war to climate change or reduce the war to poppies or drought, but to just acknowledge the contributing factor that it plays. And so I thought if even this war has some climatological aspect to it, this is worth investigating elsewhere. But interestingly, so why is Afghanistan in crisis? Is it this catastrophic convergence that I was describing earlier? Neoliberalism, Cold War militarism, the onset of climate change? Not really, because this combination, the catastrophic convergence, doesn't play out equally in the same proportions everywhere. In Afghanistan, there really hasn't ever been any kind of economic restructuring along free market lines. The reason Afghanistan collapsed in the early 90s into civil war and became a failed state has everything to do with Cold War militarism and really nothing at all to do with the direct application of neoliberal structural adjustment to the economy. And the story there is that the Soviet Union and the US were fighting it out through proxies. Well, the Soviet Union not so, not through proxies, but with actual troops there. And the US was pouring billions of dollars, matched dollar for dollar by Saudi Arabia through Pakistan to defeat this effort in Afghanistan. The forces that the US and Pakistan supported and built up were called the Mujahideen. They were this, Pashtun primarily. I mean, there was, during the jihad against the Soviets, there was all ethnic groups were involved in this struggle. But in Afghanistan, the majority minority are the Pashtun. They're about 42% of the population. They live primarily in the south of the country. And after the collapse of Afghanistan, the Soviets leave in 88, late 88, early 88, or early 89. No, 88 actually, I think. The regime there, the Afghan regime there, sort of switches from being communist to nationalist, changes its name to Watan, which means nation or homeland, from being the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, really tries to become a nationalist party rather than a communist party, hangs on actually until the Soviet Union collapses and aid is cut off. At that point, the Mujahideen come in, they take over, and these 7 parties begin fighting among themselves. They destroy half of the city of Kabul. 100,000 people are killed in the civil war. And the country is a violent, desperate mess for many years. And then beginning in the mid-late 90s, out of this arises the Taliban, which is sort of a kind of Robin Hood, millenarian, law and order movement of Pashtuns coming out of the south, saying enough of this warlordism, enough of this crazy violence, and imposing a very, very strict interpretation of Sharia on the state. And out of that comes 9/11, et cetera, et cetera. And NATO is there now, been there for 10 years. And climate change definitely has something to do with why and how it drags on. An example of how climate change plays out in an urban setting would be just north in Kyrgyzstan. In 2010, some of you might remember there were ethnic clashes between Kyrgyz and Uzbeks in Kyrgyzstan. And the capital, Bishkek, parts of it went up in flames. There were thousands of Kyrgyz nationals, but who have of Uzbek descent, fleeing towards the Uzbekistan border. They were blocked by the Uzbekistan army. One government fell, another government came in. There was a formal request that the Russians send in troops. The Russians declined, having had previous experience intervening in mountainous Central Asian nations. Eventually, things have stabilized. You read about this crisis in the newspaper, it sounds like, well, Kyrgyz and Uzbeks, they just don't like each other, and occasionally they go at it, and they go after each other. But dig a little deeper, and lo and behold, there's a climatological aspect to this, an environmental aspect. So Kyrgyzstan gets about 90% of its electricity from hydroelectric power, most of that from this one very big Soviet-built dam on the Toktala Reservoir. The same drought that has been hammering Afghanistan for the last decade had caused the water levels in the Toktala Dam to drop to their lowest levels ever recorded by 2005. In response to this, the government has to ration power. So then businesses, factories, don't have electricity 24 hours a day, and they have to start laying people off. That has further negative economic consequences. It means there's less demand. It means, fewer people going to buy a pair of shoes or going to the bakery to buy a loaf of bread. And so you get this process of economic contraction, growing unemployment, growing desperation. This was also exacerbated by neoliberal economic restructuring. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, Kyrgyzstan, like many former Soviet republics, underwent a type of economic shock therapy that was about rapid and radical privatization and deregulation. The effects on the social welfare of people in Kyrgyzstan was so intense that the government had to back off this beginning around 2000. Due to this economic crisis linked to this drought and the power rationing, the government decided that it was going to re-engage the privatization process, and that the first assets it would put up for sale would be the dam and the utility lines, basically the power infrastructure. To make those assets more attractive, they doubled the power tariff. They doubled the amount of electricity, the amount of money people had to pay for electricity. On top of this comes one of the worst, coldest, driest winters in many decades. Pipes are bursting in the apartment blocks, senior citizens freezing to death, cattle freezing to death on the hillsides. The whole, and this was before 2010, this is in winter 2008, 2009, or maybe it was 2007, 2008. And the government basically, the country essentially shut down except for essential services for several months that winter, which, didn't help the economy at all. So by the time this privatization effort is going forward and power prices have doubled with a promise that they'll go up again, people hit the streets in the spring of 2010 demanding that power prices come down, demanding that the government provide education, intervene in the economy somehow to increase opportunity for people. This protest that begins as a set of economic demands soon devolves into ethnic clashes because the protests are essentially hijacked by groups of lumpenized young men who haven't had jobs, who haven't had education, who've spent their formative years hanging out in casinos with their ethnic kin, drinking vodka, getting angry. And so they essentially hijack a popular upsurge and turn it into these violent ethnic clashes, which end with, pogroms and, neighborhoods barricading themselves and a horrible ethnic conflict that could have gotten much worse. So you see from that example that underneath this ethnic conflict is an economic crisis. And underneath that economic crisis is an environmental crisis. The fact that the dam that provides 90% of the electricity for the entire economy was in crisis because there wasn't enough water. Because this drought that fits the pattern that's been predicted for climate change had brought the hydroelectric sector to its knees. So there you see climate change and neoliberalism interacting, but Cold War militarism not really playing much of a part in it. So what I'm saying is that you get these different variations in different places. Another place that I looked at was India. And India is, the world's largest democracy, robust growth rates, et cetera, et cetera. It also has more absolutely poor people living in it than does all of sub-Saharan Africa. It also has one of the longest guerrilla wars ongoing on the planet. Outside of, I think, Colombia and maybe a few very small conflicts in northern Burma, it's one of the oldest. And what you have in India is maybe I'll make this map bigger. The book does say geography in the title, right? So I should probably, well, if I can't see the screen, I can't make it bigger. Oh, wait. Yeah, I see. Wait, I know how to use a computer. I do.
Actually, double click on India.
I don't know how to use I don't know how to use a computer really well, but I do know how to use one. Okay. All right, well, let's not get caught up in technology, or you'll drag me into another pet peeve of mine, which is railing against technology. So, the war is being conducted by a group of Maoist guerrillas that are continually sort of forming and reforming into different parties. They're known by the sobriquet of the Naxalites. That's their nickname. And that's because the conflict began in 1967 with a massacre up in West Bengal in the district of Naxalbari, or the village of Naxalbari in the district of Darjeeling, where the tea is from. And there was a peaceful protest and several land occupation. Several people were murdered. And out of this emerged a guerrilla war, a Maoist guerrilla war that sought to emulate the Chinese model of communism that held that the peasantry were the class that could make history. You don't have to industrialize and wait for there to be an industrial working class to do this, that the peasants can do this. And so it's been a peasants' war that's gone on for over 40 years. For most of this war, the conflict was was contained up in West Bengal. But over the last 15 years, it has sort of extended down through Orissa, into Chhattisgarh, into Andhra Pradesh, and even further south to some extent. And if you lay a map of what's called the Red Corridor, districts that have Naxalite military activity, over a map of drought-stricken districts in India, they almost match up one for one. And so the Red Corridor, in many ways, is the drought corridor, this area here. And again, the caveat that it fits the pattern. You can't say, oh, this drought would not have happened if there wasn't climate change, but it fits the pattern. And so how here, what is the connection? Okay, Naxalites follow the drought, but that doesn't explain causality exactly. What's going on? And so I went to northern Andhra Pradesh to look into how this war was unfolding and what the driving causes were, and relying on the work of an Indian economic historian named Vamsi. This is really his work here that I'm about to use. The mechanism that connects drought and violence in the Red Corridor is the credit markets. So what's going on in Andhra Pradesh is that there's severe drought due to liberalization of the Indian economy beginning in 1991. The sort of semi-socialist economic policies of the Congress era, derided in the US and the UK as the license Raj, because there was lots of corruption and you had to get licenses for everything. But there was an element of sort of support for small farmers. There were government-owned banks. There were agricultural extension programs. There were efforts to use government ownership and economic intervention and regulation to build up the agricultural sector and to build up the economy as a whole. After '91, in the name of economic efficiency, these programs are systematically stripped away and reduced to mere shadows of themselves or eliminated. So, by the late 90s, in a place like Andhra Pradesh, and in the last decade, farmers facing drought have very little support from the state. There's nothing they can really get from the state. So you have a bad year, what do? You borrow money to buy seeds to plant again and hope that next year won't be as dry. The only place they can get credit is on the private credit market from money lenders. The money lenders, interestingly enough, don't take land as collateral, at least in Andhra Pradesh. Partly because they're just about money, they don't want to manage farms, and partly because the environmental crisis is so steep that they don't want to be held, they don't want to be left holding this land that might not be worth anything. So they'll extend credit only for crops. If they extend credit for food crops, they run the risk that the farmers might steal the collateral. That is, they might eat the crops instead of sell them and pay the moneylender back. So they refuse to advance credit for food crops. And instead, they will only advance credit for cotton. Because what are you going to do with cotton? You can't eat it, right? You can't feed it to your children. The only thing you can do with cotton, if you're a farmer, is bring it to market, turn it into money, and then the moneylenders can reach in and grab it. So the effect of this is that as the drought worsened, the debt builds. As the debt builds, more and more cotton is produced. The more cotton that's produced, the lower the price of cotton, the less the income, and the worse the situation. And so in Andhra Pradesh, 2,000 farmers have committed suicide by drinking the pesticides used for cotton. And across India, some of you probably know this, some of you probably read international news and history, an estimated 200,000 farmers have committed suicide because of this kind of crisis. So you can imagine if you're a farmer and you're ready to drink poison and the Naxalites come along and they say, hey, we've got a solution to your problem. We've got a short-term solution and a long-term solution. The long-term solution is we're going to take state power and we're going to build a Maoist economy and state in India. You may or may not buy that. Their short-term solution, though, short-term solution. Next time the moneylender comes to town trying to get money from you, we're going to stop his car, we're going to drag him out, we're going to shoot him. And then when the cops come, we're going to ambush them. And we're going to drive the state and their police and their moneylenders out of here. So if you're on the verge of drinking poison, committing a type of political suicide, why not wait a little bit and commit political homicide and help the Naxalites? And that's what many people have done. So there you see neoliberalism and the onset of climate change, but not really Cold War militarism creating destabilization. And unfortunately, the response of the Indian state has been, more often than not, to increase repression, build up paramilitary police forces that are really like armies. They're not police forces as we think of them. And the war drags on. So those are examples from the global south. But how does climate change possibly affect or cause violence in the global north? And here you can see it's less direct form, but one way you see it is through border militarization and a feeling that there, as Jeffrey has talked about, there's a kind of militarized response to the idea that refugees are coming to the U.S. And I argue that that climate refugees are real. That when your economy and your livelihood collapses due to extreme weather, that is a real problem. Obviously, a militarized response, building up the border into a long, thin police state, is not a response I would endorse. So, around the issue of border militarization, this is a project that, by the way, extends inland. Don't think that the border stops at the border. There's a 100-mile buffer zone where the Border Patrol has basically the right to effectively suspend your Fourth Amendment protection against undue search and seizure. And they can ask people for their papers, they can search cars. It's because being that close to the border is probable cause. The Border Patrol, if it were a standalone army, would have one of the largest air forces in the world. On any given night, there are 30,000 people held in detention facilities, most of them actually privately run, very unaccountable. Some of you might have read my first book, Lockdown America, which is about police and prisons in the US building up since the 60s. And I actually critique the idea that private prisons have driven the prison buildup, because they're just not that big a part of the whole equation. But in terms of immigrant detention, they're really important, and private firms control it. So this is a form of violence that's about controlling migrant labor, about controlling immigrants, about keeping people disorganized in California so they don't demand higher wages. But increasingly, supporters of this kind of policy articulate their agenda in environmental concerns. They say, there's an environmental crisis. The Greens are right, but we don't embrace their solution. There's not enough to go around. The U.S. is basically a lifeboat. We got to arm it. We got to keep people out. And you have characters like Deborah Walker, someone I profile in the book, who considers herself a Northern Californian environmentalist and is very clearly, a racist. The stuff she says about Latinos is appalling, and I'm not going to repeat it to you. You can read it in the book. In places like Phoenix and much of Arizona, where they passed SB 1070, right, which mandates that police check anyone they think might be an undocumented immigrant. It doesn't empower them or allow them. It mandates that they do this and allow citizens to sue individual police officers if they don't. That's about eroding the rights of American citizens as well. People who support that, increasingly, a minority element of that xenophobic lobby, think and articulate their project in environmental terms and in terms of environmental crisis. And a little caveat, I think that it's very important that progressives articulate a more credible and better, but also environmentally rooted explanation of what's going on. So that's one example of how the global north is militarizing in response to, in anticipation of climate change. And I went to Juarez and went looking to see if are there people here who would qualify as climate refugees? Are there people who have been driven from their homes by environmental crisis? Sure enough, it's not that hard to find people. Found a guy sitting on the south bank of the Rio Grande, looking into the US. He had been deported from the US. He'd had a job as a roofer in Las Cruces, New Mexico. He said, I called my boss, and he says, I can have my job back if I can get back into the US. And I can't get across the border if I don't have $3,000. All the easy passages have been militarized. You got to go through the mountainous desert. The only reasonable way to do this is to pay a coyote, and that costs $3,000. And here I am broke. What am I going to do? How am I going to make $3,000 in Juarez? The only answer is basically get involved in the drug trade. Help out some criminal organization, taking care of problems and taking care of business. And he didn't want to do that. And it's not to say that the violence in Juarez, which is now beginning to decline to some extent, is reducible to the displacement of people by climate change, but part of what fueled it was lots of people who needed work, lots of people who were totally desperate. So this guy, this fisherman, before he was in Las Cruces and deported, he had been in Michoacan. He was a fisherman, and the El Nino of 1997-98 led to a red tide, an algae bloom that drove away the fish. He had a very bad year. He went into debt, again, because of neoliberalism. The old statist, capitalist, but statist developmentalist structures of the Mexican economy had been stripped away in the name of free markets. This is what NAFTA achieved. The Mexican Constitution of 1917 was considered the first socialist constitution in the world, even though Mexico was very clearly a capitalist economy ever since then. But it had certain guarantees. It had Article 27 of the Mexican Constitution said that basically everything in Mexico, down to the rock salt, belongs to the state and is communal property, and private property exists at the pleasure of the state, and its rights can always be revoked. And that article is rewritten in NAFTA, and so what that means is that all the old regulations that used to protect small fishermen, subsidized loans, restrictions protecting them against competition with big fleets, guaranteed prices from government-owned or partially government-owned packing and export houses, all that was privatized, stripped away. So this fisherman found himself with no support other than to go to the private market. He eventually couldn't pay his debts. As the water warmed, the fish never came back. He lost his skiff. He worked in shrimp fishing for a while and then moved north to work in the US. Other people I met in Juarez were Tarahumara Indians who were very explicit. They're like, yeah, we left our homes in the Sierra Maestra because it's too dry. We can't grow anything there anymore. And for a while, we cut down the trees to survive. And now those are all gone. So here we are in Juarez, hoping to get construction work, hoping to get manufacturing work. They didn't think this was about climate change. I asked them, I said, why do you think your homeland has gotten so dry? And they said, it must be because we cut down all the trees. It must be about deforestation, which is empirically true at a local level to some extent. But Mexico has been suffering serious drought, worst drought in 60 years, punctuated by freak flooding, the same pattern again. And again, so what I'm saying is not that climate change is the main driver of migration, but that along with the economic restructuring, which has really driven people out of their previous livelihoods to hit the road and go north. There is a new and exacerbating factor, which is the environmental crisis that also helps, along with neoliberal economic policies, helps push people off the land onto the road to the US border, where they are confronted by a police state, an incipient police state run by a democracy. And you find similar things on the borders of Europe. But perhaps more disturbing is the response of military planners in the US and Europe and Australia. And unlike the political class in the United States, unlike the Republican Party, which venerates and fawns over the military and militarism, but denies climate science, the military takes climate science very seriously. And it bases its projections for future action on the climate science as it is vetted by the IPCC, which you presumably have heard about earlier today. But the IPCC's whole function is to basically vet climate science and make it, digest it so that it is legible to policymakers. And the military takes that science seriously, and what they project from that is a world in which there is not so much increased interstate conflict over resources, but increased internal conflict in states that at first glance looks like ethnic or religious conflict frequently, but is increasingly driven by the displacements, the economic displacements caused by extreme weather associated with climate change. And they predict that they will be called, the US military predicts that it will be called to respond again and again and again over the coming decades in what amounts to a sort of ongoing, open-ended, global-scale counterinsurgency. And to their credit, in the end of these reports, there are these secret reports, but there are also public reports. The Quadrennial Defense Review, which is a sort of big strategy document that comes out every 4 years, just came out. This has a whole section on climate change. There are numerous other public reports. You can just Google this up and you'll see what military thinking is. And to their credit, in the end of most of these reports, they say, we can keep a lid on this for a while, but if the political class, the civilian political class, doesn't mitigate the problem, i.e. cut greenhouse gas emissions, and come up with other types of adaptation, there's limits to what you can do by killing people and jailing them. And I think already we can start interpreting some of the conflicts that are ongoing as driven by climate change and involving this kind of open-ended counterinsurgency response. I mean, look at the Arab Spring. Something of a misnomer to some extent. I mean, it's always nice to see a kleptocratic dictator fall, but, the Arab Spring has led to several wars. A heating up of the ongoing war in Yemen, the war in Syria, the war in Libya, and Libya, very clearly begat the war in Mali to some extent. Weapons and personnel flowed into Mali from Libya. I mean, this was predicted. People say if you overthrow the Gaddafi regime, if you smash up Libya, there's going to be reverberations in the neighboring region. And so in Mali, there was, a Libyan colonel was operating with the Tuareg rebels there. The Tuareg are the sort of nomadic, semi-nomadic pastoralists of the north, who have actually been fighting a war on and off in about 4 or 5 different phases since the early 60s. And they're increasingly bound up with jihadists, many of whom are international, and weapons that have flown in from, not flown, but flowed in from Libya. And in response to the rapid successes of this insurgency, as you all know, the French have gone in and are now fighting a counterinsurgency in Mali. The US is already providing aerial surveillance there. The US is, has drones. It's, using drones in Yemen. Much of the world is pressuring the US to get involved in Syria. Now, what's the climate connection? Well, if you look at how the Arab Spring jumped off, first of all, look at the key events as I see it, in the year 2010, 2011, was the second major food price spike in less than a decade. In 2007, there was a massive food price spike. 2010, 2011, a second food price spike. The price of corn on international markets went up by, I think, 93%, wheat up by 81%. Why was that? Some of it was speculation, but a lot of it had to do with environmental crisis in the main grain belts of the world. So you had a combination of flooding and drought, flooding in the upper Midwest, drought beginning in the lower Midwest, flooding and drought in Australia, which continues. They've had several years of this drought punctuated by crazy floods. And in the Black Sea region, around here, Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, major wheat producers and wheat exporters. Very, very bad drought, the worst in 100 years. Some of you might remember in 2010, there were like forest fires that were so bad in Russia that the smoke was choking Moscow. Well, in the grain belt, that meant really, really bad harvests. So it got so bad that Russia canceled all of its wheat export contracts. It was encouraged to do this by one of the single largest commodity traders in the world, Glencore. Well, who's the single largest wheat importer in the world? Egypt. And during 2010, 2011, food inflation in Egypt was running at close to 30%. The average Egyptian spends 40% of their income on food. One of the things that people were demanding in Tahrir Square was to lower the price of life's basic necessities. The last thing President Ben Ali of Tunisia did, which is where this was the first state to fall, Tunisia, last thing he did was promise to lower the price of food. And Tunisia as well is a major wheat importer. So it's not to reduce those conflicts to the price of food, but you got to ask yourself, why did Egypt rebel against Hosni Mubarak when it did? Why not 5 years later? Why not 5 years previously? I think something has to do with it, the second food price shock in 5 years. And that food price shock is clearly linked to climate change. And so then the response is that in certain, the region slips into warfare. The West is responding militarily. We don't call this climate war, and one shouldn't reduce it to climate change, but you can see how climate change is part of what caused this crisis, which is far from over in that region. So on that happy note, I do have a whole section in the book on how to mitigate and adapt to this. And in a nutshell, I think that the United States is still the largest economy in the world. We're the largest greenhouse gas emitter per capita. Well, actually, Australia is the largest per capita. We can do a lot to deal with this problem. And the good news is we already have the laws in place that we need to deal with this. We don't need new climate legislation. This was the great tragedy of the first 2 years of the Obama administration, wasting all that time coming up with bad and doomed to fail climate legislation. We have the Clean Air Act of 1970, which due to a lawsuit, Massachusetts versus EPA, now covers greenhouse gas emissions. The EPA is obliged to regulate, essentially put a de facto price on carbon emissions, and they have not been doing that. This law passed in 2007. Bush just ignored it. Obama came in and said, we're going to take this seriously. We're going to follow the law. He puts a good woman in charge of the EPA, Lisa Jackson. She's like, she takes the problem seriously. She wasn't some sort of hack, but she was kept on a really tight leash and resigned rather than go into the second term. It's rumored because she was so dissatisfied with that, plus her fear that the Keystone XL pipeline would be produced. So anyway, you've got the law that you need to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. We have the technology. It's not like we haven't invented commercial scale wind power, solar, et cetera, et cetera. It's not like we don't know how to retrofit buildings to make them massively more efficient. It's not like we haven't invented electric vehicles. All of that technology exists. It needs to be scaled up. Oh, well, where's the money? Well, there's actually enormous amounts of money. The private sector is sitting on more uninvested cash than at any time since 1956, according to the Federal Reserve. This is not money given out as bonuses to CEOs. It's not money paid out as stock dividends. It's money retained by firms specifically for investment that they're not investing because they're waiting for cues. If the government gave them the right cues, a lot of that money would probably move into building out a new clean energy infrastructure. And just as importantly, there's lots of money tied up in government. And this is something that liberals and progressives don't talk about because it's a talking point of the right. This is what you hear on Fox News. Government is too big, and so then the liberals just do nothing. The progressives are afraid to deal with it, as opposed to saying, no, it's not too big, but you're right, it is pretty big, actually. That if you don't double count money that the federal government gives to states, but you count state and federal economic activity, it constitutes more than 1/3 of the US economy. Well, what could be done with that? The federal government is the single largest consumer of energy in the US economy. It has a fleet of 450,000 mostly very large, wasteful office buildings that all could be retrofitted. It has hundreds of thousands of vehicles in its various fleets. The post office alone has about 150,000 vehicles, the average one of which drives 18 miles a day and parks in the same place every night. Why is the postal fleet not electric? There's no reason that that's not electrified. The government is going to buy vehicles, it's going to buy fuel for those vehicles, it's going to buy electricity for its buildings, no matter what. The government, the president doesn't have to go to Congress and say, please, could I have some money to pay for the electricity for the federal government? That's going to happen. So why not use the purchasing power of the public sector to start jump-starting markets, to create markets for clean energy and clean technology? And if the government used its purchasing power to help create these markets, then private firms would come in and start investing, and some of that capital that firms are sitting on and not investing would move in that direction. So, I mean, that's a very, very basic kind of outline, but the point is to just, sweep away some doom and gloom that might result from looking at the kind of military political situation of the world. The good news is that the most powerful, the biggest economy in the world has the three things it needs. It has the legal framework, it has the technology, and it has the money to start moving in the right direction. So that being the case, there's a lot of work to do. And on that note, I will shut up and take your questions. I rambled on and on. I'm sorry about that. You should have told me to shut up.
Minutes for questions, so
all right.
Thank you very much. And who's got questions? Yep.
Thank you.
All right, raise your hand if you have a question.
First, thank you, Christian. So, as you know, a lot of the neoliberal structuring and adjustments that you were talking about have already occurred and continue to occur in other parts of the world are in some degree happening in Europe right now, in Greece and in other countries, as they try to figure out what to do with their economy and their economic problems. Have you taken the time to look at how climate change is affecting some of those? How climate change is affecting some of the crises in those respective countries as well, and how that's sort of tying into a lot of the economic restructuring and neoliberal policies that are playing out there?
I have not, no. I have not looked into a climatological angle on that. I mean, the one thing I would say is that austerity is, in my opinion, not what we need to tackle this problem. I think what we need to build in resilience and shift off of fossil fuels, which is to say to mitigate and to build new forms of economic activity, adapt, and new social relations that can deal with these emergencies, that part of what that requires is a healthy, flexible, robust public sector. And the project of dismembering the public sector in Europe, I think, is very dangerous and a grave mistake. So, I mean, that's very indirect, but it's like, this is a move in the wrong direction in terms of thinking about how to deal with climate change. And, just to be clear, I'm sorry I wasn't here earlier today. My plane got messed up, so I don't know exactly what has been said before, but, the science on this is very good, and it's getting better all the time. And you sound crazy to even just say what the scientific consensus is. And just to be clear, there's no debate among scientists about this stuff. There's a debate in the editorial pages of newspapers, but that's not the same as scientific discourse. in peer-reviewed journals, and the major scientific bodies of the world agree. They don't agree on all the details, but they agree on the basic components of the problem, that civilization's burning of fossil fuels has loaded the atmosphere with greenhouse gases, primarily CO2. We're beyond 400 parts per million of CO2. We know from ice samples taken from Greenland and other methods that before the Industrial Revolution, CO2 levels, atmospheric CO2 levels hadn't gone beyond 280 parts per million. So all of this is causing more heat to be retained by the Earth, and that is causing the climate system to go out of whack. And that, frighteningly, there's very clearly a lag between cause and effect, that you don't just feel the effects of the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. You feel the effects of previous levels of CO2, and that the amount of heat that's being trapped now, the impact of that is in the mail. You're not going to feel it for some years to come. And what is predicted is, not good for Europe. And they need to start planning, and they need to start, building in resilience, preparing for long, long droughts, preparing for sudden floods, dealing with that. And gutting the state doesn't help you do that. Yes.
Who else? That's a question. Okay.
You,
I don't know if I necessarily did microphone. We spoke a little about the opium crop in Afghanistan, and we know there's a market for medicinal opium in the United States and everywhere else, as used in hospitals, doctors' offices, etc. How is the market controlled so that the Taliban has to be the ones who tell these farmers in Afghanistan that it's okay to drill? Who is controlling this market? Where it just seems to me that there's some dynamics of power in economics that are keeping the market contained to only certain people can profit from the opium industry. That's the legit part of the industry.
Yeah. Well, the opium produced in Afghanistan is all done outside of legal channels, and there's never really been any serious consideration of making that legal opium. There has been a proposal put forward by the ICOC, I think it's now called, but it used to be called the Sinless Foundation. Does anybody know this? Do you know this? They do work. They started in Afghanistan. They do work in Brazil now. And some kind of like forward-thinking British billionaire gave this NGO and research foundation money to think about what was going on there. And they put out a number of really interesting reports, and they're not a crackpot group at all. And they put out a very well-documented, very reasonable report saying, in a world where there are, people with HIV, dying of HIV, dying of tuberculosis, there's a crisis of pain all over the world. Why not put the kibosh on this aspect of the war by just buying up the opium crop and making it legal, and making, and subsidizing pain relief in the areas of the global south where people can't afford to buy morphine as they die of cancer and HIV. And this was, just laughed out of the room. That's totally crazy. But, I mean, if you were serious about building an economy that functioned in Afghanistan, that's actually one of the first steps you would take. And, to some extent, to the credit of the US, when they first went in, the policy was like, ignore the drugs. Don't get involved. But it was right-wing domestic pressure, pandering to local audiences that had no concept of what was going on in Afghanistan, that put pressure on the Bush administration to make opium part of the agenda.
Okay, question.
There's a guy right here.
We want you to be on film. Your voice.
So you talked about how droughts and sudden flash floods are a big part of the climate change, and what is being done to kind of mitigate that risk of you have all these droughts, but then you also get a sudden flash flood, which makes it worse because even though you're receiving rain, it's not doing what it's supposed to. I know there's projects just right below the Sahara of trying to make some kind of tree belt to help hold the soil, because when the rains do come, if you could keep it, it would help fight against this desertification. Are there projects being put in place to help fight this, like in places like Australia or the Midwest, or is this just kind of saying, this is just nature, so whatever?
I don't know of any good planning around this yet in the U.S. Midwest or in Australia, but I haven't really looked into it in Australia. I mean, you're right about that. That tree planting effort in Mali and other parts of West Africa has been very successful, raised the water table. There are piecemeal efforts to deal with this. There are pilot projects, to build in resilience. In some places to wall off the water, in some places to build cities so that they can be, they can absorb water. I mean, Holland is the best example where, in Rotterdam, the main square has under it a huge sort of catch basin. So if there's a flood, a lot of the water is captured in that and then can be discharged later. So there are interesting engineering experiments like that all over the place, but few of them, to my knowledge, and I haven't looked into it that closely, are being scaled up in the way that they could and should be. That's not a very well-informed answer. I'm sure, Terry, I forgot your last name, I'm sorry, but our colleague here, formerly of the UN, could speak much more eloquently to the details of that kind of effort around the world. He ran, those of you who didn't see him speak earlier, he ran the UN's sustainability efforts for a number of years. So,
One more question? Anyone? No? Okay, well then join me